What happens when a Hollywood star known for grace and discipline suddenly pauses, leans forward, and decides she's done smoothing things over on live television? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. Whoopi smiles into the camera, that familiar calm but alert expression on her face, and says it's a big day because they've got an actor who's been part of some of the biggest franchises in movie history. Someone who doesn't do talk shows just to promote a film, but to actually talk. Zoe Saldana walks out to applause that's warm and loud, the kind that says the audience already respects her before she's said a word. She hugs Whoopi, exchanges quick greetings with Joy, Sarah, Alyssa, and Sunny, and settles into her seat. There's an ease to her posture at first, relaxed shoulders, polite smile, eyes scanning the table like she's reading the room. Whoopi starts with the obvious, congratulating Zoe on her latest project, calling her career quietly legendary, which gets a chuckle from the audience. Zoe thanks her, says she's grateful, says she's in a phase of her life where she's choosing projects that align with her values and her family. It's smooth, safe, the kind of opening that keeps everyone comfortable. Sunny nods along, hands folded, listening closely. Joy jumps in with a light joke about Zoe always being blue, green, or purple on screen, which gets laughter. Zoe laughs too, saying she jokes with her kids that they barely recognize her human face. The energy is friendly. Sarah asks about motherhood and balance, and Zoe answers thoughtfully, talking about boundaries, about saying no more often, about protecting her peace. The audience murmurs in agreement. Sunny leans forward slightly, eyes narrowing in that familiar way that signals she's about to pivot the conversation. Sunny says she wants to talk about something Zoe mentioned in a recent interview, about identity and representation, about being a Latina woman in Hollywood and the expectations that come with that. The tone shifts just a bit. Zoe nods, still calm, saying it's an important conversation and she's happy to have it. Sunny thanks her, then says she found the interview interesting, pausing just long enough for that word to feel loaded. Sunny says that some people felt Zoe's comments came across as distancing herself from certain conversations in the Latino community, especially around activism and speaking out. The audience quiets, that subtle live TV hush where everyone senses a turn. Zoe's smile tightens, not gone, but more measured. She says she understands why people might feel that way, but she thinks nuance gets lost online. Sunny presses, asking if Zoe thinks public figures have a responsibility to be more vocal, especially when they've benefited from representation. Zoe inhales, a visible breath, then answers carefully. She says responsibility looks different for different people, that she's always believed in showing up through her work and her private actions, not just sound bites. Alyssa nods, murmuring agreement. Joy raises an eyebrow but stays quiet. Sunny tilts her head and says, respectfully, that silence can also be a statement, especially in moments of social tension. There's no hostility in her voice, but it's firm. Zoe's posture changes. She sits up straighter, folds her hands together on the table. She says she doesn't see herself as silent, just selective. She says she's seen how performative activism can be, how loud statements don't always translate into real change. Whoopi interjects lightly, trying to keep things balanced, saying there are many ways to contribute and not everyone has to do it the same way. The audience applauds briefly. Sunny nods, but doesn't fully let go. She says she agrees, but adds that when you have a platform as large as Zoe's, people listen whether you intend them to or not. Zoe looks directly at Sunny now, eye contact steady. She says, I hear you, but the way she says it signals that something is building underneath. She explains that for years she felt boxed in, told how to speak, when to speak, what version of herself was acceptable. She says she's done letting the public dictate her conscience. There's a murmur from the audience, a mix of approval and tension. Sunny responds that she's not trying to dictate, but to question the impact. She brings up moments in history where voices mattered, where silence hurt. The word silence hangs in the air. Zoe's jaw tightens slightly. She says she's lived through those moments too, as a woman of color, as an immigrant's daughter, and she resents the implication that she hasn't done enough because she didn't do it publicly. Joy jumps in, saying this feels like a generational divide, that not everything needs to be litigated on social media. Sarah agrees, saying there's pressure now to comment on everything immediately. Sunny holds her ground, saying accountability isn't a social media trend, it's civic responsibility. The audience reacts audibly, some clapping, some murmuring disagreement. Zoe's voice remains controlled, but there's a new edge to it. She says accountability also includes respecting that people can fight battles quietly. She says she funds programs, mentors young actors, supports causes without cameras. She asks, "Does that stop counting because I didn't tweet it?" There's a beat of silence after that question, heavier than the previous noise. Sunny pauses, choosing her words, and says no, it doesn't stop counting, but visibility inspires others. Zoe nods slowly, then says inspiration can also come from seeing someone protect their mental health and refuse to perform pain for public consumption. The audience applauds louder this time. Whoopi smiles, sensing the crowd's lean. Sunny opens her mouth to respond, but Zoe continues, not raising her voice, just speaking more firmly now. She says she's tired of women, especially women of color, being asked to prove their worth through constant explanation. She says she showed up to share her work, not to be put on trial. The table goes quiet. Even Joy looks surprised. Sunny sits back slightly, lips pressed together. Whoopi steps in again, saying these are hard conversations and it's good they're having them. She tries to lighten the mood, but the tension doesn't fully release. Zoe exhales, a small shake of the head, then softens her tone, saying she respects Sunny and the question, but needed to be honest. Sunny nods, saying she appreciates the honesty, though her expression suggests there's more she wants to say. The audience applauds, not roaring, but sustained, acknowledging the moment. The camera lingers on Zoe's face for a second longer than usual, her expression composed but intense. There's a palpable sense that the conversation has shifted from polite promotion to something rawer, something unresolved. And as Whoopi transitions to a quick break, promising more with Zoe after the commercial, the silence at the table feels heavier than any argument, leaving everyone watching aware that this is far from over. The lights come back up after the break, and there's a subtle but unmistakable shift at the table. The audience applause is polite, a little restrained, like everyone's recalibrating. Zoe takes a sip of water, sets the glass down carefully. Sunny adjusts the papers in front of her, not looking up right away. Whoopi thanks everyone for sticking with them and says these are the kinds of conversations they don't shy away from on this show, even when they get uncomfortable. She turns to Zoe and asks how she learned to set boundaries in an industry that constantly asks for more. It sounds like a reset question, but everyone knows it's connected to what just happened. Zoe answers slowly, choosing her words, saying it came from burnout, from realizing she was giving explanations to strangers who weren't actually listening. She says at some point you have to decide who deserves access to you. Sunny nods, then says she wants to clarify something. Her tone is calm, measured, but serious. She says her intention wasn't to put Zoe on trial, but to explore how public figures navigate influence. She says she asks these questions of everyone, including herself. The audience is quiet again, leaning in. Zoe listens, eyes steady, then says she understands that intellectually, but emotionally it hits differently when the question keeps circling back to whether you're enough. She says that's a question women of color grow up with, long before fame. She mentions walking into rooms where she was told she was too ambiguous, not Latina enough for one role, too Latina for another. Joy lets out a soft hum of recognition. Sunny responds that she relates to that deeply, that she's faced similar boxes in journalism and law. She says that's why she believes visibility matters so much, because it breaks those boxes. Zoe tilts her head and says sometimes it just creates new ones. The audience reacts with a low murmur, that collective oof sound when a point lands. Alyssa jumps in, saying there's also a danger in expecting celebrities to be moral compasses for entire communities. She says it can absolve institutions of responsibility. Sarah agrees, adding that the internet flattens complex people into sound bites. Sunny listens, hands clasped, then says she agrees with that critique, but still believes voices with reach can shift culture faster than policy sometimes. Zoe exhales through her nose, a small sign of frustration. She says culture shifts when people see humanity, not perfection. She says she's watched colleagues get torn apart for saying the wrong thing, even when their intentions were good. She looks directly at Sunny again and says, "That fear is real." Her voice softens on the last word. There's a pause. Sunny looks back at her, expression less sharp now, more reflective. She says fear is real, but so is harm when silence is interpreted as indifference. Zoe's eyebrows lift slightly. She says interpretation isn't something she can control, and she refuses to live her life reacting to assumptions. The audience claps, louder this time, some people cheering. Whoopi interjects, half smiling, saying this is why people argue on Thanksgiving. Laughter breaks some of the tension, but it doesn't fully dissolve. Zoe smiles briefly, then adds that she's not anti-speaking out, she's anti-performing. She says when she speaks, she wants it to be because she's informed, grounded, and ready to stand by it even when the cameras leave. Sunny asks, gently now, if Zoe thinks there's a middle ground. Zoe nods, saying she's still searching for it, and that conversations like this, messy as they are, might be part of that process. The audience applauds again, more warmly. Joy leans forward and says she thinks there's also a difference between activism and advocacy, and that we've blurred those lines. She says some people do the work quietly and some do it loudly, and both matter. Sunny agrees, but adds that the public often only sees the loud. Zoe responds that maybe that's a media problem, not an individual one. There's a ripple through the audience at that. Sunny smiles tightly and says, fair point. But then she adds that media reflects what people respond to. Zoe counters that media also shapes what people think they should respond to. The back and forth is calm, but intense, like two people fencing with words. Whoopi watches closely, ready to step in if needed. Sarah comments that this feels like a conversation about trust, trusting public figures to act ethically even when we don't see it. Zoe nods emphatically, saying yes, that's exactly it. She says trust has to go both ways, and right now it feels broken. She gestures vaguely outward, toward the audience, the cameras, the world beyond the studio. Sunny takes a breath and says she hears that, and maybe she needs to reflect on how questions land, not just how they're intended. Zoe's shoulders relax a fraction at that. She says she appreciates that acknowledgement. The room feels slightly lighter, but still charged. Whoopi asks Zoe how she handles criticism, now compared to earlier in her career. Zoe laughs softly, saying she doesn't Google herself anymore. The audience laughs with her. She says she listens to people she trusts, not strangers yelling into the void. Sunny chuckles, saying that's probably healthy advice for everyone. Then Sunny adds, almost offhandedly, that sometimes the loudest critics are from within your own community. Zoe's smile fades a little. She nods slowly and says that's been the hardest part. She says criticism from outside hurts, but from inside cuts deeper. There's a hush, the kind that signals vulnerability. She continues, voice steady but emotional, saying she's felt judged for marrying who she married, for the language she speaks, for how she identifies. She says at some point she had to stop trying to satisfy everyone and just be honest with herself. The audience applauds, some people standing briefly before sitting back down. Sunny looks genuinely moved now. She says that's something she doesn't think gets talked about enough. She says communities aren't monoliths, and internal policing can be brutal. Zoe nods, eyes glistening just slightly, but she blinks it back. Whoopi wraps the segment by saying this is why they invite people like Zoe on, because she doesn't shy away from complexity. She thanks her for staying in the conversation. Zoe thanks her back, and then, unexpectedly, thanks Sunny for pushing her, even if it was uncomfortable. Sunny smiles, saying discomfort can be productive. The audience applauds as the cameras pull back a bit, but there's still an undercurrent of tension, the sense that while something's shifted, not everything is resolved. As Whoopi teases what's coming up next, the looks exchanged around the table suggest that the hardest part of this conversation might still be ahead. When the show comes back again, the energy is different in a quieter way. The applause is there, but it's more scattered, like the audience is still processing what they just watched. Zoe sits with her hands folded, shoulders squared, calm on the surface but clearly alert. Sunny leans back slightly, arms uncrossed now, listening posture engaged. Whoopi thanks the audience and says she wants to keep going because clearly this struck a nerve, not just at the table but out there too. She turns to Sunny and asks how she personally balances asking tough questions without making guests feel attacked. It's a direct move, and a few people in the audience murmur. Sunny doesn't bristle. She nods and says it's something she thinks about a lot, especially as a woman of color in a space that demands both empathy and accountability. She says her job is to push, but she never wants to erase someone's lived experience in the process. Zoe watches her closely, then says she appreciates hearing that said out loud. She adds that sometimes the push feels less like curiosity and more like a verdict already reached. There's no accusation in her tone, but the point lands. Sunny acknowledges it, saying intention doesn't cancel impact. The audience reacts with a low hum of agreement. Joy jumps in, half joking, saying this is starting to sound like a group therapy session. Laughter ripples through the studio, easing the pressure for a moment. Zoe smiles, but then says maybe that's not such a bad thing. She says Hollywood could use more therapy and less pretending. The audience laughs louder, clapping. Alyssa shifts the conversation slightly, asking Zoe if there was a specific moment when she decided she wouldn't play along with expectations anymore. Zoe thinks for a second, then says it wasn't one moment, it was an accumulation. She talks about press junkets where every question about her work turned into a referendum on her identity. She says she realized she was answering for an entire community instead of just herself. Sunny listens intently, then asks if Zoe worries that stepping back leaves a vacuum that others fill, sometimes irresponsibly. Zoe nods slowly, acknowledging the concern. She says that does worry her, but she also worries about losing herself by constantly being on. She says you can't pour from an empty cup, and she's been empty before. There's a beat where no one speaks. The audience is completely silent now. Whoopi lets it sit, not rushing in. Zoe continues, saying she learned the hard way that survival sometimes looks like disappointing people. That line hits. A few audience members clap spontaneously, others nod. Sunny responds that disappointment can still coexist with respect, and that she respects Zoe for being honest even when it's uncomfortable. Zoe looks at her, genuinely, and says that means more than she realizes. The tension between them softens, but it doesn't disappear. It evolves into something more layered. Sarah brings up the role of social media again, saying it amplifies conflict without context. Zoe agrees, saying nuance doesn't trend. She says a 30-second clip can erase a lifetime of work. Sunny adds that as someone in media, that scares her too. She says they're all operating inside a system that rewards outrage. Zoe leans forward slightly and says that's where her frustration comes from. She says she's asked to be both authentic and perfectly palatable, which is impossible. She says when she speaks from the heart, it's dissected. When she stays quiet, it's condemned. Her voice tightens just a bit. The audience murmurs sympathetically. Joy nods, saying women can't win in these situations. Whoopi agrees, saying the rules change depending on who's watching. Sunny interjects that while that's true, disengaging completely isn't the answer either. Zoe responds quickly, saying she hasn't disengaged. She's just disengaged from performance. The emphasis is subtle but firm. The two lock eyes for a moment. It's not hostile, but it's intense. Sunny breaks the gaze first, nodding slowly, and says she sees the distinction. She admits that maybe she and others in her position need to do a better job of making space for that difference. The audience applauds again, this time more unified. Whoopi takes a breath and says this conversation is clearly resonating because it's honest. She asks Zoe what she hopes people take away from this moment. Zoe pauses longer than she has all day. She looks out toward the audience, then back at the table, then finally says she hopes people remember that public figures are still people. She says disagreement doesn't have to mean dismissal. Sunny follows up by asking what accountability looks like to Zoe, if not public statements. Zoe answers without hesitation now. She says it looks like consistency. She says it's showing up for the same causes when no one is watching, treating people well when there's nothing to gain, and being willing to listen without immediately reacting. The audience applauds, some people snapping their fingers softly. Sunny nods, visibly thoughtful. She says that challenges her, and she appreciates being challenged. Zoe smiles faintly, saying the feeling is mutual. There's a shared moment of understanding, but also the awareness that they still don't fully agree. Joy cracks another joke about needing a commercial break to recover emotionally. Laughter breaks out again, but it's tinged with sincerity. Whoopi smiles and says they're almost out of time, but she's glad they didn't shy away from this. As the segment winds down, the camera catches Zoe and Sunny exchanging a brief look. Not confrontational, not warm, but respectful. The audience applauds as Whoopi thanks Zoe once more for her openness. The applause is sustained now, fuller than before. But as the clapping fades, there's a lingering sense in the room that something important happened, something unscripted and unresolved. The conversation didn't end in agreement, but in understanding, and that somehow feels heavier. When the show heads into its final moments, the silence between beats carries more weight than any raised voice, setting the stage for a final chapter that everyone knows will ripple far beyond the studio walls. When the show returns for its final stretch, the atmosphere is noticeably subdued, almost reverent. The audience applause is steady but softer, like people don't want to break whatever fragile calm has settled over the table. Zoe sits back in her chair now, hands resting in her lap, expression composed but tired in a very human way. Sunny straightens her notes but doesn't look down at them. Whoopi glances across the table and says sometimes the last few minutes of a show say more than the first 20. She asks Zoe how she feels right now, in this moment, after having such a layered conversation in front of millions of people. Zoe lets out a small laugh, not humorous, more like a release. She says she feels exposed, but also relieved. She says it's rare to have the space to finish a thought without it being reduced to a headline halfway through. The audience responds with gentle applause. Sunny nods and says she appreciates Zoe staying in the conversation instead of shutting down. She admits that some guests disengage when things get uncomfortable. Zoe looks at her and says she considered it, honestly. A ripple of reaction moves through the crowd. Zoe explains that walking away would have been easier, but it would have reinforced the very thing they were talking about, assumptions, distance, and silence filling the gaps. Sunny responds quietly that she respects that choice. She says these moments are hard on both sides of the table, and viewers don't always see that. There's a pause, then she adds that she hopes people watching understand that questioning doesn't always equal condemnation. Zoe nods, but gently says impact still matters, even when intentions are good. Sunny agrees, saying that's something she's going to sit with. Joy leans in and says she's been doing this show a long time, and moments like this are what people remember. She says not the shouting, not the jokes, but the pauses. Sarah agrees, saying the silence said as much as the words. Alyssa adds that this is the kind of exchange that actually moves culture forward, even if it's uncomfortable. Whoopi turns to the audience and says you can feel it in the room when something real happens. The audience applauds again, a little louder now. She then looks back at Zoe and asks what she thinks will happen once the clips start circulating online. Zoe smiles wryly and says she's sure a lot of context will be lost. Laughter ripples through the crowd. She continues, saying she knows there will be think pieces, tweets, comments calling her brave and others calling her disappointing. She says she's learned to accept that you don't control the narrative once it leaves your mouth. What you can control is whether you spoke truthfully. The audience applauds, some people standing briefly. Sunny adds that social media tends to reward conflict over conversation, and this moment will likely be framed as a clash instead of a dialogue. Zoe glances at her and says that's already happening just by being here. Sunny gives a small, knowing smile. Whoopi asks if Zoe has any regrets about what she said today. Zoe shakes her head slowly. She says she regrets that conversations like this are so rare that they feel explosive when they happen. She says disagreement shouldn't feel like danger. That line draws a strong reaction from the audience, applause mixed with murmurs of agreement. Sunny looks thoughtful and says she doesn't regret asking the questions, but she does regret how easily nuance gets flattened afterward. She says she hopes viewers see two women trying to understand each other, not two sides trying to win. Zoe nods and says winning was never the goal. Being honest was. As the clock winds down, Whoopi begins to wrap things up. She thanks Zoe again for coming on and says this is why live television still matters. Zoe thanks the hosts and the audience, saying she knows not everyone will agree with her, but she hopes people listen before reacting. Sunny thanks her as well, adding that respect doesn't require agreement. The audience applause swells as the camera pulls back. But even as the clapping fills the studio, there's a noticeable stillness between Zoe and Sunny. Not cold, not warm, just reflective. They exchange a brief nod, a quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful passed between them. After the show ends, the aftermath moves fast. Clips flood social media within minutes. Some headlines frame it as Zoe Saldana pushing back against Sunny Hostin. Others call it a tense silence, pointing to the pauses, the eye contact, the moments where neither spoke. Fans take sides. Some praise Zoe for setting boundaries. Others argue Sunny was right to push for accountability. Hashtags trend. Short clips rack up millions of views, stripped of the longer context. By that evening, both women are trending. Comment sections are divided but passionate. Some viewers say they felt seen for the first time. Others say the conversation made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite name. Media analysts praise the exchange as rare, unscripted television. Critics say it exposed a deeper divide about expectations placed on public figures. Behind the scenes, sources say the mood after the cameras stopped rolling was quiet, respectful. No shouting, no blow-up. Just two women gathering their things, exchanging a few final words off mic, and walking away with a lot to think about. Neither issues an immediate statement, letting the moment stand on its own. And days later, the conversation is still going, not just about what was said, but how it was said and why moments like that feel so charged in the first place. Whether viewers saw conflict or connection depends on where they're standing. Now it's your turn. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.